funded by the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland with the television licence fee.
I'm Paul Wright and you're listening to the fourth programme of Greening the White House, the 7-part series which explores the island of Ireland ancestry of various US presidents, with a key focus on the ancestral homesteads and locations linked to them in Ireland. In our last programme we investigated the County Tyrone roots of the 18th US President Ulysses S. Grant. In this programme the spotlight falls first on the 21st US President Chester Alan Arthur, who served in high office from 1881 to 1885, and whose ancestors came from the village of Cullybackey in County Antrim. So what exactly are President Arthur's County Antrim roots? May Kirkpatrick, a tour guide with the Arthur Cottage and Interpretive Centre located in Cullybackey, County Antrim.
As far as we know, the Arthurs came over from Scotland originally, and she was Campbell, member of Clan Campbell, and they came over here. We're not exactly sure when, but the descendants of them came down through the years until Alan lived here in the cottage with his wife and had children, one of which was young William, who went to America, who became the father
William
of the president.
He was born in 1797 or thereabouts, am I correct?
Yes, that's right. We talk about Wee Willie, we call him Wee Willie. Sometimes we do have sort of a bit of a reenactment here, and there's Wee Willie and there's his mother and father and his Aunt Eliza who's doing the baking. But anyhow, Wee Willie, as we call him, William Arthur, he left here with his parents.
And that's the same William Arthur who eventually emigrated with other members of his family to North America between 1816 and 1820. There he met and married a woman named Malvina Stone, and it was their son who became US President in 1881. But we're jumping slightly ahead in our story, getting back to what life was like for the Arthurs in Cullybackey in the early 19th century, before they emigrated to America. One of the big problems which they faced was not being allowed to own the land which they farmed.
At that time, they didn't own their own farms. They just paid rent to the landlord. And that might have been one of the reasons why they decided to go away, because there was no prospect of them ever owning their farm. At that time, there wasn't anyway.
And May, it was just after the Napoleonic Wars, sometime between 1816 and 1820, am I correct, when they left?
Yes. The problem is the passenger lists are missing. Where they arrived and they went via Canada, the passenger lists are missing. We haven't been able to determine the date, but what we did find was that young William, who was very clever, went to college at Inst in Belfast. So they must have had money to be able to send them there, because the farm, although it wasn't large, they would have done their weaving and sold their cloth, and they would have had a weaving loom, and the children would have helped, and they would have sold their cloth, and then he had the farm as well.
And one of the biggest income sources for the Arthur family was producing and weaving flax linen. Kieran Fagan, manager of the Monrea Heritage Centre in East County, Donegal.
The flax linen was the primary industry of the region.
And why did flax linen take off, especially in this area that, the north of Ireland became absolutely synonymous with it for centuries, right up to relatively recent decades?
Well, it was due to taxation from the English on the woolen industry. They taxed it so heavily so that it could not compete with the woolen industry. But there were studies done to see what industry would replace the woolen industry. And apparently the soil quality and the climate were ideal for the flax industries.
The quite good income that the weaver farmers had in those days from their linen, for they would have taken their linen into Linen Hall Street and sold it, or somebody would have come round and bought it and that sort of thing. So he had that as well. But they must have had quite a good livelihood here, especially when they were able to let William go to study.
May Kirkpatrick. Here's Marion Gregg, who's also a tour guide at the Arthur Cottage in Cullybackey, County Antrim, to discuss how the Arthur family lived.
Well, if they were farmers, it would be they'd be self-sufficient probably. They would probably had a cow, maybe two, because we think they're quite well-to-do. And there was 26 acres of ground, I think, or something on this farm. And
which was quite substantive for the time, because it was...
they didn't own it, they were paying rent, but you had a few hens, probably a pig or two, and probably a wee crop, a few cabbages, leeks or something like that. And the mother would have done the bacon. There'd been no running down to the spar. And they churned made their own butter, they had their own milk, the buttermilk. So you had the buttermilk left after you churned the butter. And that was used for many things like baking soda bread, baking pancakes, which would have been a delicacy. As I tell the young children here, it'd be more like chocolate biscuits nowadays. But soda bread would have been the main thing, and probably baked fresh every day over the fire. And then
and we're just beside the fire here. It's raging there. The listeners can probably hear it. A lovely raging heart.
The fire is the heart of the house, and it would have been on 24 hours a day because you couldn't have let it go out. You needed it first thing in the morning, and you banked it up at night so that you could just give it a rake up in the morning and away it went. And you would have cut your own peats again for the fire. You would have had your own fuel and gathered sticks, which I still do, and things like that. You were quite self-sufficient.
And as was touched on earlier, historical archives tell that William Arthur, the future president's father, left Cullybackey for North America sometime between 1816 and 1820. He was accompanied by other members of his family, and no doubt one of the reasons for their going was that hunger stalked much of Ireland at the time. May Kirkpatrick.
Apparently there was I'm calling it a mini potato famine, but there was a shortage, or there was trouble with the potatoes round about the time they went as well. And then William was clever and he had better chance maybe in America, so maybe all those things maybe made the family decide that they would be better off to go to America. So away they went.
Away they went. Where would he have left? Okay, he leaves Cullybackey. The family en masse leave Cullybackey. Alan, Eliza, their son William, who's a young man, a young ambitious man. It's very obvious from what you're saying, May. Or did he leave from Larne or where?
Well, we don't know that. Again, passenger lists are missing. We've looked in the passenger lists. They're available in the library and whatnot. We haven't found anything yet. But I imagine they would have gone from Derry or Londonderry to leave from there. And as I say, we're not sure. We just don't know. But they went via Canada because there was a bit of contention or trouble at that time, and it was better apparently to arrive in Canada than arrive in America. And then William, he taught school, and then he eventually married. His wife was Baptist, and he became a Baptist preacher then, and because of that he was moving all over the countryside, back and forward, even into Canada. But they had quite a big family, and Alan was born. He was the first boy to be born, and there was great excitement when Alan was born.
Born in 1829 in Vermont, if I'm correct.
Yes, in Vermont.
Chester himself was born in Vermont in 1829, elected to vice president in 1880, and following the assassination of President Garfield in 1881, he succeeded to the presidency. So he never visited his sort of ancestral homeland, but his son, Chester Alan Arthur Jr., visited the cottage in Cullybackey with his aunt, the president's sister, later in life.
Matthew Warwick, Education Officer with the Ulster Scots Agency in Belfast. Here's May Kirkpatrick once again.
During the time that he was president and after his wife died, his sister, Mrs. McElroy, brought his son, Chester Alan Arthur Jr., over here to Cullybackey to look for the ancestral home and everything.
So his own son, Chester Arthur Jr., and his sister came back to the house here during his actual presidency.
Yes,
wow.
They did, and we did find an extract from an old newspaper which said that while they were here, they visited Mrs. Evans. Now, there was a Mrs. Evans left up the street in Cullybackey, and Chester Alan Arthur Jr. went into the garden and ate green gooseberries and was sick.
Chester Alan Arthur served as the 21st President of the United States from 1881 to 1885. He was just one of several 19th century US presidents with strong Ulster Presbyterian roots. So just how does history judge his presidency? Dr. Daniel Geary, the Mark Pickett Professor of US History at Trinity College, Dublin.
Arthur is certainly one of the lesser-known U.S. presidents. For one thing, he takes over as vice president when the president is assassinated, Garfield is assassinated, and so he's not so well known. He serves less than one full term. He installed indoor plumbing into the White House, so that's one thing that he did, and was generally considered to be someone who, after the sort of shock of this assassination, kept things on a level field. Now, Arthur had been known, and people have been very suspicious of him because he'd been fairly corrupt. He'd been a customs official in New York City. Famously, customs officials are, very well positioned to take bribes and payments. So people thought, oh my goodness, especially this is the Gilded Age, they thought with Arthur as president that it would just be, open season for, and that things would just be
a free for all.
Yeah, a free for all corruption. And Arthur did not let that happen. So in that sense, he was, I'm not sure whether that's exactly a praise, but, he didn't turn out nearly as badly as people feared at the time.
And what would be his legacy, Daniel?
Well, again, I think he's one who's less remembered. He was one of the great blues musicians, best known as Howling Wolf, was actually named Chester Allen Burnett. So it was named after Chester Arthur. So I like that as one of his legacies. He's one of the more entertaining figures, as people learn about American presidential history.
Chester Arthur, interestingly too, to think about him as an individual is he probably goes quite strongly against the emerging stereotype of Ulster-Presbyterians in the later 19th century, or indeed the Scotch-Irish in America.
Patrick Fitzgerald, Head of Research and Development at the Mellon Centre for Migration Studies, based in the Ulster American Folk Park, situated near Omagh in County Tyrone.
Because he was a very dapper dresser. He appeared, quite flamboyant. I wouldn't use the word gay in the current context, but he certainly was a very flamboyant individual who loved to dress up. And he was also quite an extrovert, who's somebody who liked mixing with people, quite lively and good conversationalist, partier, And I think that's quite an interesting, because it again shows us, that if the minute you try to put people into an ethnic stereotype, they're going to go against it. So I think Arthur kind of represents that.
And when you read the accounts of his presidency, Paddy, he jumps out as just a larger-than-life, a lover of life kind of figure. The kind of guy, bonhomie, you want to be around, whatever about the politics.
No, totally. I think that is it. But it also reminds us of the fact that there's this world where all the presidents have both a public face and a public persona and then a private persona. And some of those presidents were quite different as individuals behind the scenes than they were the public face.
And perhaps the best place to learn about the public and private sides of President Chester Alan Arthur is the Arthur Cottage and Interpretive Centre located in Cullybackey, County Antrim. Here's tour guide May Kirkpatrick once more to explain one of the centre's many exhibits related to President Arthur.
We're looking at the actual story of the president himself and how he became president and different events that happened during his presidency and how he was the school children are always very interested. We always tell them to say, now look here and see how many pairs of trousers Chester Alan Arthur owned, for he was very much into fashion. He owned 80 pairs of trousers.
80? I'd say that grabs the attention, doesn't it?
It does. The children, would say, how many pairs of trousers have you got? And some of them would say, oh, I've got 10, and they usually exaggerate. But anyway, or maybe nowadays they do have 10, but that was we things like this they're interested in. And these are different things that happened during the time he was president. The Statue of Liberty was laid in 1884.
During his presidency?
The bridge was built, and 6 days after it was built, there was a panic. They thought it was going to collapse, and people got off, and 12 were crushed to death and 40 injured, apparently. And Buffalo Bill organised his first Wild West, so these are things that happened.
I'm talking with another good person here now, in the heart of the Arthur Cottage. Who am I talking with?
So I'm Patricia McEldowney. I look after the cottage here along with the ladies. And so I've just newly come in, so slowly learning all about what Arthur has done. But
what do you like about the man himself? Chester Alan Archer, 21st President of the United States, served in office from 1881 to 1885 during a very interesting period in United States history.
Well, I suppose being a woman, I was fascinated with his love of fashion, especially back in that time, and how many clothes he had. I think it's apparent.
80 pair of pants?
Yes, I think it's excellent. I think every man should be aspired to be like him.
Brilliant. And also as well, I mean, he got the White House revamped no less by Tiffany. Louis Tiffany, you know, the famous Tiffany's of New York.
Oh yes, absolutely. The man had great taste and style, so but what do you expect from his roots, you know, he was...
Here in County Antrim.
Absolutely, you know, we set him off in a good state, so no, he's to be admired, he did well, so we're very proud to have that connection.
And May Kirkpatrick had this to say about what young visitors to Arthur Cottage are often most surprised about with the place.
The young ones, especially the school children, are amazed that there's no bathroom or shower or toilet or television or electricity, or I mean, how they wonder how they could have survived without all that. And really, it's just the atmosphere of the place. I think they love it, and the smell. I forgot to mention the smell of the peats, or the peat reek as we call it. It really hits you even before you come in the doors. You come up the lane, you smell the peat, and actually sometimes we go home and we still smell the peat. And
well, that's what kind of, you know, the tourists love. You know, I was talking to one just the other day, and they were saying, you know, the sheep, you know, in the surrounding fields, and the smell of the peach, and the soda bread cooked by your colleague here, Marion. You just can't make it up.
No, I mean, Marion soda bread has a completely different taste from bought soda bread, or even you make soda bread in your own kitchen. It still doesn't taste the same. It must be the peat smoke, reek and everything.
Well, what's the secret, Marion? What's the secret?
I don't know. the griddle.
The $2 million question.
This is it. No, it definitely takes on a different taste when you bake.
Because, you know, you're bake it over the fire, the peat fire,
yes.
So it's the real McCoy.
It's the real McCoy. And once you get the griddle warmed up, you can't turn a knob up or down, and you have to work with it with the fire. And when you get a good fire on, you can do a lot in a short time.
We better stop talking, because my stomach, I'm getting hungry just listening to this, you know. And bidding farewell to the beautiful confines of President Arthur's ancestral home in Cullybackey, County Antrim, but staying with the topic of US presidents with ancestral links to the island of Ireland. The 28th US President Woodrow Wilson was the grandson of James Wilson, who emigrated from Durgalt near Strabane in County Tyrone to the United States in 1807. Now, to find out more about President Wilson's County Tyrone roots, I recently visited the original Wilson homestead in Durgalt, and here's who I got talking with there.
My name's Liam Corey. I work at the Ulster Folk Park as a curator. Today we're at the President Wilson homestead just outside Strabane in a townland called Durgalt.
And Liam, just tell us, what's the County Tyrone related ancestry of the 28th US President Woodrow Wilson regarding this house here, the homestead here, please?
Well, obviously whenever Woodrow Wilson was elected President in 1912, caused quite a bit of a stir in Ireland. They knew that he had Irish roots, and there was quickly two competing claims for where his ancestry had come from. One from County Down, and the other then from outside Strabane in County Tyrone. And it was a wee bit foggy at the time, but it fairly quickly became established that it was the Strabane house that could lay claim to the ancestors of President Wilson. Local history sources indicated that James Wilson, who was President Wilson's grandfather, left Strabane around about 1807 and went to Philadelphia.
Woodrow Wilson, he certainly has Ulster roots from County Tyrone.
There's the President Woodrow Wilson cottage at Strabane in County Tyrone.
Wilson was known as the Presbyterian President. Family roots back into County Tyrone. So hugely aware again of his heritage.
That heritage being an Ulster Scots Presbyterian one, since President Wilson's grandfather James Wilson was himself descended from Scottish Presbyterians who migrated to Ulster during the 17th century. So how might the Wilson family of Dergalt have survived before young James eventually emigrated to America? Historian Brian Mitchell of the Tyrone Museum in Derry City.
Their lifestyle, small holding, presumably involved in the linen industry, growing flax, earning for the time, a comfortable enough living on a farm. But when young men and women as well reached that age, late teens, early 20s, they thought, right, it's time to be thinking, what's our next move?
Are we going to stay here,
yeah.
or maybe the grass is greener in the new world?
Yeah, and
we'll head over there and try and make our pie.
I think, let's be honest, it was a problem in Ireland, wasn't it? Farms being subdivided to such an extent that nobody could eke out a good existence from them. So I think maybe more so in the Presbyterian community, there was more a case that it was only one son was going to inherit the farm, so the rest, sons, daughters, had to look elsewhere for marriage opportunities or for immigration, whatever. So, and I think the Ulster Scots were open to movement. And also within the northwest here, Derry was a thriving port with plenty of connections with Philadelphia.
Wilson's people would have been tenant farmers. They wouldn't have owned their own land, and the landlord, whenever times were good, was always inclined to put up the rent at the end of the leases.
Historian Liam Corey of the Ulster American Folk Park. In other words, James Wilson would have realised that his chances of prospering in Ireland were limited, in contrast to the countless opportunities in America.
He would have known people who had emigrated over the past 20 years and probably heard that they'd been doing quite well, and probably made a decision at that point in his life, in his early 20s, to strike out for America and maybe see if he could do better out there. He had ambition. Obviously the trip across the Atlantic and the sailing ship in the 1800s, particularly during the Napoleonic Wars, was potentially a very dangerous trip.
But thankfully James Wilson survived that ship journey from Ireland to America. So how did things go for him upon his arrival in Philadelphia? Historian Brian Mitchell.
James Wilson became involved in the printing trade in Philadelphia. And again, it's one of those stories, now you wonder, it makes a nice story, I'm not too certain the degree of truth in it, but they say that James Wilson served his apprenticeship in Gray's printing press, which is run as a tourist, is still open as a facility it's not a functioning printing press anymore, but it operates in Strabane. Because during the 18th century, Strabane seemingly had a lively publishing scene, so I'm told. But so they say that James Wilson served his apprenticeship with Gray's printing press. But anyway, he went out to his uncle, who was running a printing business in Philadelphia, and he certainly established himself in Philadelphia. So, if you liked, Woodrow's roots are very much from his grandfather, James Wilson.
And eventually James Wilson settled in Steubenville, Ohio, where he published an anti-slavery newspaper, got married and had a family. His son Joseph was the father of Woodrow Wilson, who was born in Staunton, Virginia in 1856. After completing his schooling, Woodrow eventually qualified as a lawyer. So how did his career progress? Liam Corey.
Woodrow Wilson's life, he's interested in the law, but he gets fed up with the practice of the law, and he prefers to stay within academia and work within academia. So he works at Princeton University, and fairly soon works his way up to the top of Princeton University. From there, he gets interested in politics and slowly but surely moves himself up the Democratic tree. So much so that he becomes the presidential candidate for the 1912 presidency.
And obviously wins it and becomes the 28th President of the United States.
Wins that, becomes 28th President, and then retains the presidency again then 4 years later. So he's the President during the time of the First World War.
Woodrow Wilson was President of the United States from 1913 to 1921. Now, although controversy surrounds aspects of his presidency, in particular his role in the 1919 Versailles peace talks, nevertheless, as President he oversaw the passing of much progressive legislation, which greatly improved the quality of life for countless ordinary Americans. Also, he was the chief architect of the League of Nations, the post-World War I prototype of our modern United Nations. Dr. Patrick Fitzgerald.
So in some ways you could argue, Wilson, that he was ahead of his times. I think there's certainly an element of a vision there in terms of how you could try to address the problems that, as he had interpreted it, led to the outbreak of the European Great War. So the idea that there was an institution in which international members would come together, the League of Nations, which really is a preface to the establishment of the United Nations, had long-term implications in the attempt to try to address issues so that you would cut off conflicts before they grew to the state where it would involve a second global war.
The whole idea of an international global community started by Woodrow Wilson. And we're sitting here 100 years later with the United Nations and everything else, which owes its roots into Woodrow Wilson.
Ian Crozier of the Ulster Scots Agency. Here's Brian Mitchell.
Woodrow Wilson, defender of democracy, is obviously highly regarded.
He would be judged as being one of the better presidents, definitely well above average.
Wilson would be considered one of the most important, one of the most well-known presidents, and one of the better ones.
The small cottage where US President Woodrow Wilson's grandfather James Wilson was reared in is situated just outside Strabane in County Tyrone and is a major tourist attraction. Liam Curry of the Ulster American Folk Park on location at the cottage.
Maybe just to say, really, it's a fairly typical whitewashed stone-built farmhouse with a thatched roof, with the very small windows in at the time. Of course, when it was built, initially glass could have been very expensive, and these windows mightn't have been put in until the 1820s, 1830s. But very much the feel and the character of an Irish farmhouse of that early 1800s.
And to discover more about yet another US President with ancestral links to Ireland, then make sure to catch our next number 5 programme in this 7-part Greening the White House series, where we'll be visiting the County Wexford ancestral home of the 35th US President, John Fitzgerald Kennedy.
Funded by the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland with the television licence fee.